Hi, everyone. This is Gabriella Hoffman. Among the many hats that I wear, I am a visiting fellow with the Independent Women's Forum. And this week, I was very fortunate enough to publish my first policy focus. I haven't really done papers of this magnitude. I largely am doing reporting work. And I think the last time I wrote something academic, in a sense, was when I was in college about a decade ago. So it's really an honor that IWF has vested interest in my conservation work through almost the year or so that I've worked with them. And it has led to the creation and production of a policy focus on true conservation and kind of this examination into the current state of environmentalism in the United States. And what better month to do this, and especially leading up to Earth Week and Earth Day, than April when we talk about environmentalism, when energy and environment is discussed, and especially with current events and where US energy policy is currently positioned. I would say that energy policy could improve in many regards, but this is going to largely focus on land use, wildlife conservation, forest management, and other things. So I'm going to briefly talk about and show you what my policy focus looks like because I want you to read it. But before I do, I have to give kudos, especially to one of my supervisors, Charlotte Whalen, who I've worked closely with in the almost year that I've been an IWF fellow. Leaning on her was very, very critical to ensure the publication of this. And then also Hadley Heath Hadley Heath Manning and a few other ladies at IWF were also very instrumental in seeing this project in this paper coming to fruition. So I have a lot to be thankful for and I placed a lot of trust in these ladies and they placed trust in me with executing this project. So I want to share with you briefly what this is and encourage you to read it. Please, please, please read this. Don't just watch this and then be complacent. If you want some source material, my policy focus includes a lot of links for you to take away to implement to, let's say, your public policy debates on social media if you're writing an article. I try to keep things very informative, but I want to share how you can, first and foremost, access my policy brief. Let's configure this. Beautiful. Okay, so if you head over to iwf.org and you go to my profile, I have a author page there. You'll see my picture, a nice headshot that one of my dear friends, Anang Mittal, took of me a few years ago, and people like to use that for headshot purposes. But you will see my biography, and you can scroll down to my work, and you will be able to click on my policy focus. Here you go. It was published earlier this week. There's a lot going on in the news, so I understand some of you may have not been able to see this. I mean, a lot of things get clogged in the news cycle. It's a 24/7 news cycle, so it's really hard to get content. So I'm using this occasion to showcase what I've done with you all. And the policy focus is entitled The Future of Environmentalism, True Conservation. You've seen me probably catalog a lot of my lectures across the country to students and to community members in various different places. I've gone from San Antonio, Texas to Upper Peninsula, Michigan, and I just recently returned from 2 trips to Columbus, Ohio, and Boston University, where I spoke at length about free market environmentalism, which is largely a big component of this policy focus. But I've been speaking on true conservation to college campuses, largely to conservative audiences, and it's also formulated to even appeal to people who are not conservative politically. But I think as a political conservative, we should be honing in on conservation. We live out these conservation principles, whether we run operations in farming, ranching, maybe an outfitting business, maybe you have a lot of acres, you have a lot of land and use it for commercial or not commercial usage. We really like the spaces around us. We like to move to rural areas, and even in suburban areas. And I live in a suburban area just outside Washington, D.C. in Virginia. I like to have a lot of space. So I appreciate green spaces. So personally for me, it's part of my mission to educate the masses on kind of underexplored topics in conservation and environmentalism. Briefly, before I detail what the policy focus is about and overview the 6 pages for you, conservation is a term that I think is a positive term for environmentalism. Environmentalism, when you poll it, is kind of not positively received among people on the center right, moderates included. Conservation, from what I've seen with different polling and also just talking to different people, message testing, when you just do it even on a casual basis, people receive that term better. I've noticed the audiences that I've speak to have said, well, I actually really like this. I support this because of the way that you phrased environmentalism as conservation. That's one thing you should also take away from this. But also, a lot of people, especially on the left, and those who are in kind of this environmental movement, and they largely do have a lot of overlap. The political left and radical environmentalism are usually one and the same. They have a lot of the same interests. And environmentalists, the status quo environmentalists, those who have dominance over culture, education, media, love to conflate preservation, which is the most appropriate term for what their kind of notion of environmentalism, versus conservation. So conservation is the wise use of natural resources. That could mean for recreational purposes, simply accessing a park, fishing, hunting, things of that sort, grazing, ranching, having a timber operation, to preservation, which is usually a view of no use of natural resources for recreational or commercial purposes, definitely not for commercial purposes. So we see a lot of people in kind of the environmental movement saying and admonishing capitalism, humans are negative and they're hurting the environment the most, when in fact we're the ones rectifying a lot of problems, because it's impossible to let nature run its course. That could be posing a lot of problems. So you have to understand the differences between the terminology, and I think using conservation in dialogue and in your writing and in your conversations with people, you'll get people to like environmentalism in this respect when you're using this term. I think this is a better term to use because environmentalism has been so tried and used, and it's often associated with negative anti-capitalist attitudes, just giving preference to nature versus people. And I think what you can take away from my policy focus is that people, the economy, and nature can all work together, and there doesn't have to be sacrifices for one versus the other. I don't think you see many people saying, yes, we have to have development of everything, of every acre, of every forest. That's an archaic view too. It's a very small extreme subset of the country that supports destroying everything to build up a mall or to destroy nature. But we have the other extreme, which says humans on the landscape are terrible for the environment. Humans are contributing the most to these problems, and there's no hope for humans. So we have to have these policies. So we give preference to nature. And in many places across the country, especially out west, when you don't, let's say, have active management in place of forests or of wildlife species, you see a lot of human nature or human wildlife species conflicts. This is very evident in battles relating to the gray wolf, the grizzly bear, forest fires. So when you have these preservationist policies in place, you see a lot of chaos in the landscape, a lot of wasted resources, taxpayer resources wasted. You don't allow input from different stakeholders, which is essential if you want to have environmentalism work. You need every stakeholder, not just the federal government and special interest groups and environmental interests. You have to have everyone, from the landowner to activists to local and state government officials to every interest you could possibly have. And we're not really seeing that. We're seeing a preference, unfortunately, given to certain interests, not all interests, like what we did see in the prior administration. We did see a lot of stakeholder relationships built going back to the individual. All right, so here is a little synopsis of my policy brief, and then I'm going to get to the PDF version. Here's where you click it. This is a fairly easy read. If you're not too keen on reading academic papers, I can assure you my policy brief is very easy to digest. I'm not going to bore you with legalese or these lopsided words or use any jargon that may lead to confusion or foster any doubt in your mind. So this is very simple, very easy to understand and extrapolate. And there's a very nice cover photo of a forest, and you can see what it is. There's an introduction, a highlight sentence, and then I also make the argument, of course, that the US is a leading interest for conservation across the globe. People do look to us for technology, for having balanced use, for having a flourishing economy with strident environmental standards, or rather, high quality environmental standards. We don't want strident environmental standards because that could create problems. I want to correct myself on that. So I talk about how the US is already leading here, but we have obstacles currently faced by and presented by the federal government, including this White House that we have, unfortunately. We have them pursuing, and I make the argument they're pursuing preservationist environmental policies. Again, not true conservation, preservation, because they're saying even amidst the energy crisis we have, the hikes we're seeing in oil and gas, they refuse to use the resources we have available because they say, well, how could we do this here? We're going to destroy the environment if we don't have a clean energy transition. So they're scoffing at the notion of true conservation using the energy resources we have available in oil and natural gas, and they're leaning on other countries to do it. That's asinine. That shouldn't be happening. So I explained briefly where we are as a country and how we've kind of buoyed back and forth between preservation and true conservation. Now we're back in preservation, environmentalism. So you get to see that. And then I list 4 top points of policy areas where conservation works really well. Forest management being one of them. Across the Eastern Seaboard, if you guys didn't know this, states with kind of this more private land model, interestingly enough, are better managers and stewards of forest management. So in Virginia, we do a lot of prescribed burns. And actually, one state, if you guys are very curious to know, what state is actually the leader in prescribed burns and helping to mitigate the instance of forest fires, that would be the state of Florida. And actually California, which scoffs at Florida all the time. We know there's that battle between Florida and California, that rivalry that's emerged. But Florida is actually kind of inspiring California to chip away from having those preservationist policies to encourage no forest management. And they're leaning on the California Prescribed Burning Act of 1990 and the programs associated with that to fix the problems they have in California. So I talk about kind of some interesting studies and leaders of forest management. So we do forest management well. The federal government can do a lot better on this front, and states can kind of compensate for the federal government, but you have obstacles like NEPA and other environmental laws, much like what you see with other areas that prevent true conservation practices from being implemented. I also talk about maintaining multiple use management of public land, this philosophy that public lands and even private lands can have multiple uses. We're starting to see this rhetoric of encouraging this model to move away from what's already in place to this public use model, which discourages people from, let's say, having a livelihood. Out west, because of the nature of public lands, people can make a livelihood. It's been readily accepted, but a lot of environmentalists in the preservation camp don't want that standard to be upheld. They want to just have this public use model where only certain recreationists can have a say on public lands, and that is not a practical model. Much like with energy development, this is not a practical model with kind of the alternative. So I list a great alternative like the Western conservation principles. Then I also discuss species management, how we actually do that very well. So I know people have complaints about the Endangered Species Act. I think it was a necessary law. When implemented correctly, that can actually be useful and allow us to have biodiversity with respect to wildlife, keystone species, apex predators. And we have done a great job in this country of restoring a lot of imperiled species almost to their historic ranges, or at least out of extinction. And the Endangered Species Act has 100% of the time prevented the extinction of species. That it's a good preventative tool. However, when it comes to doing the second component to it, because a portion of the law says after a species has recovered, you have to delist and then downgrade their rating, this country, especially policymakers, do a terrible job of utilizing this law to its fullest potential. So we only recover 2 to 3 species. So I talk about how that has to be used to its full advantage to really see wildlife conservation take a hold. And then I conclude as a 4th point saying that individuals, actually not the government or top-down policies, are now starting to lead conservation efforts. I think when the environmental movement first came about, there was an inclination to say government has to rectify the problems of environmental issues. If we don't, in crises, if we don't have government do this, it's going to have very bad ramifications. And government maybe did have a role. And I think overall they can have a role without meddling with states and localities and giving them an equal part in the conservation pie. But we do see instances where the government has actually perpetuated environmental problems and created crises. One key example is the King Gold mine spill in 2015, where the EPA and associated contractors breached a structure there, and it led to one of the worst spills recorded in this country, about 3 million gallons tainted. And that created a lot of problems and headaches in Colorado. There's also the Flint water crisis. And there have been other instances where the government can perpetuate a lot of problems. A lot of people say, well, markets and private interests have created these other problems, but that was starting to be, I would say, debunked in the 1990s, especially following the collapse of the Soviet Union. I was reading actually a paper about the history of free market environmentalism recently, and free market environmentalism actually coincided with the collapse of the Soviet Union here in this country, interestingly enough. And we now even start to see some preservationist environmental groups adhere to and even start to adopt like voluntary exchange in their models, which will give them kudos for that. That's great to see. We start to see more private companies taking the initiative to address environmental problems. That's great. I'd rather that than the federal government. I'm not talking about ESG or some of those like social corporate policies. I'm talking about companies going out of their way, or nonprofits going out of their way to actually fix problems and not virtue signal. And we talk about in this policy focus about 3 examples. So there's a great group called the Blue Forest Conservation, and they're specializing in forest resiliency bonds. You can read more about that. So they're using capital funds, they're using private solutions and using kind of these private capital means to address problems with forest management practices and helping to fill the gap with that. It's a great, great example. I really am impressed by them. I hope I get to speak to them at some point, but I include them in their forest resiliency bond. I talk about an elk occupancy agreement from the Property and Environment Center, Property and Environment, Research Center. I don't know why that was forgotten. I think we have a little error there, but that's okay. The acronym is appropriate, but the spelling out is missing a word. But the Property and Environment Research Center, PERC, went into an agreement with the Greater Yellowstone Coalition to enter into their inaugural elk occupancy agreement, where private landowners can still do their work, but they also are incentivized to allow for kind of wildlife corridors and other habitat management efforts to allow elk, which graze there and kind of make that their range in certain migrating months there. And then also, I top it off with discussing a really cool for-profit company called 4Ocean. You guys have probably heard of 4Ocean. They're cleaning up plastic waste and plastic trash all across the world. They have collected, I think, close to 23 million pounds of trash. And they're using these private means, and they call themselves a business for good. And they're not really relying on government help, to my knowledge, but they're doing private means to recover plastic waste and to leave the different countries and the planet overall better off than they first found it. So I talk about solutions, I talk about the problems, I talk about the history a little bit, and then I offer you guys a call to action about different resources you can look to. And then obviously encouraging you to connect with Independent Women's Forum and learning about their resources and staying engaged with them. So it's been a lot of fun to issue this paper. I have had a great deal of fun working on it. I spent, a few months working on it, and now just to see it out there in public for you all to read brings me so much joy. I really appreciate each and every one of you for supporting my conservation work. I know social media algorithms may not be showing you my content, but if you are seeing this on social media, if you're engaging with my content, please be sure to share it. That's the best way that we can reach more people. And please be sure to follow Independent Women's Forum. They're a great, great outfit. I've enjoyed being a visiting fellow with them. We'll see what happens. Coming up, once I hit my year mark, maybe some potential opportunities to continue with them will happen. Check out IWF.org, also Independent Women's Voice, and also Independent Women's Network. I'm actually wearing their new shirt. I got one recently at an event I did with IWF, and they're doing great. If you're looking for women leading in public policy, this is a great, great outfit. We also have the visiting fellowship application always open. I think we are now accepting visiting fellows. If you like what I'm doing, you have a policy focus bent, and you're interested in the visiting fellow program, definitely apply for that. And just please continue to follow, comment here, comment on YouTube and all the other social media outlets, and let me know what you think. I've also included on YouTube, especially the links to the policy focus. Please be sure to share that with your friends and to anyone interested in environmental issues. And next week, I'm going to be doing my final lecture on conservation is conservative for my tour there. I'm going to be going to George Mason University. So those of you here in the Virginia area, DC metro area, writ large. If you want to come to one of my talks, you're interested to see how these talks work, you have an opportunity to come to George Mason on April 20th at 7 p.m. I think it's the Johnson Center. I will include links to it. I also have a live stream if you're unable to make it. So much to celebrate for Earth Week. I am going to hopefully do some hiking this weekend during Easter weekend. I have some more fishing trips planned. Hunting is going to take a backseat until the fall because season is largely done. I won't have any time to do turkey hunting. But I got to see my first wild turkey here in my neighborhood for the first time. I think they're starting to breed this way, so it's very exciting. But happy Easter, everyone. Thank you for watching this broadcast, and let me know how I can best serve you when it comes to conservation issues. And be sure to listen to my podcast, District of Conservation. We have great episodes, recent episodes, interviews, and policy discussions. Don't miss out. And thank you for watching. Bye, everyone.